for the Christian and the church because one of the primary aspects of the Christian life is that of suffering. There's immense significance and practicality for the life of the church, especially as it relates to suffering, as we look at this letter, because one of the main categories of the Christian life will be suffering. And one of the reasons why this is so practical is because when you consider suffering, there's one thing's for sure. No matter who you are, where you are in life, you will suffer. In different contexts of life, in different expressions, to different degrees, relationally, psychologically, physically, emotionally, you will suffer. If there's one thing that's for certain, you will suffer. That's why they have that old phrase, there's nothing certain in life besides death and taxes. And that's why it's completely practical and significant. Everyone will experience. It's part of life. And if you want to ask the question, how do you handle life? It means asking the question, how do you handle suffering? And that's because suffering raises the deepest questions of life and of meaning, of reality, of truth, and personhood. And that's why it's significant and practical. And so I want to keep that in mind for us here this morning, but I also want to confess that this letter and the Bible in its entirety will not give you every definitive answer about suffering. It's just not there, and I think that's why God gave it to us. We're not meant to know every specific answer to every definitive circumstance of suffering, but at the same time, the Bible, it'll give you a framework to understand suffering, struggles in your life. It'll help you to understand why the Christian has to go through difficulties in an ebb and flow where life goes well, but also life takes a turn for the worse. The Bible won't answer every question, but it'll give you a framework to think through this. It'll give you a sense of how to understand this. And as the scholar Dan McCartney writes, he says this about suffering: the Bible speaks about it often. It shows us how to view suffering, and it points to specific ways in which God uses suffering. So the Bible talks about it often. It shows us how to understand and view suffering, and it tells us how God uses suffering for his glory and the betterment of the people. So as we look at this letter, once again, we'll have 3 points, very similar to last week. The 3 points are this. First, we're going to look at Jesus' praise of the church. Secondly, we're going to look at the precept, which is a fancy word for commandment. And thirdly, we'll look at the promise. So the praise, the precept, and the promise. Or another way, if you like the letter C, we're going to look at the commendation, the commandment, and the comfort. 3 ways of just 2 different ways of saying the same thing: the praise, precept, and promise. So point number 1, the praise. Now, oftentimes when children get into arguments with their parents, whether you're in college or high school, elementary school, I hear this all the time, that the child will say, parents, they don't get it. They don't understand me. They don't understand the pressure. They don't understand how high school is. There's a lot of pressure there, a lot of social anxiety that comes. My parents don't get it. They don't understand how frustrating life can be. And growing up, I felt that way about my parents. My siblings did too. And so some of you in high school or in elementary school may feel that about your parents. Your parents don't get you. But when it comes to Jesus, you can't really say that. So I think parents sometimes think about that with relationship to God. God doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. He doesn't relate. But you can't say this. You may feel that, but the Bible is telling us that you can't say that, because if there's one person that really gets it and understands what you're going through, it's Jesus Christ. He understands what your struggles are better than you do. And we see this especially in verse 9. Someone understands, someone gets it, someone knows the small struggles as well as the big. And it says in verse 9, Jesus does, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. See, here Jesus, he's praising and he's commending the church for suffering well for their faithfulness. And he says, I know what you're going through. I get it. I know your tribulation, which also can be translated suffering or persecution. I know your tribulation. I know your suffering. I know your poverty. I know the slander against you. Jesus knows your suffering. So you can't say he doesn't get it. He does. He knows better than you do. So let me ask you a question here so we can develop this a little bit. If I asked you, what is the definition of suffering? What is suffering? How would you define that? How do you understand this? And I think Dan McCartney in his book, he's a professor at, I believe, Redeemer Seminary. He says this in his book. He writes in his book, Why Does It Have to Hurt? The Meaning of Christian Suffering. He gives us helpful thoughts about the nature of suffering, and he writes this to help us get our minds around the nature of suffering. He says this: knowing something and experiencing something aren't necessarily the same thing. You can experience pain and suffering, but not necessarily know what it is. And he says suffering and pain are not the same thing. Suffering is not just pain. Pain normally, even in, as some scholars say, has normally been thought of a good thing. Why? Well, because pain will tell you that something is wrong. The pain will tell you that your body needs to avoid something. That's why we let our children fall down sometimes, don't we? Because we say they got to learn through experience. They got to suffer this pain so that they could learn and they could grow and know. So pain normally is a good thing. It tells you that something is wrong and that something's not right. That's where we get the expression in our culture, hunger pains. Your body's telling you that you need to eat. You need to build your body up by eating something in your system. So pain normally is a good thing. But suffering is different from pain. It's related, but it's different from pain. Because McCartney writes, suffering is pain that seems senseless and pointless. That's the difference. You know, pain, usually there's a sense where you understand why it's there. But suffering is pain taken to the nth degree. It's pointless. There's no control. There's no rhyme or reason. That's why it's so hard. McCartney, he continues to say that when you look up the word suffer in the Bible, in the New Testament, you'll notice that every use of the word for suffering never is in reference to pain, but always in reference to oppression or to something that is caused by evil and suffering, evil and sin, wickedness. So suffering in the Bible is never talked about with pain. It's always in reference to oppression, something evil, something wicked, something sinful. And so most of the words or times that the word suffer is referenced in the New Testament, it's usually in reference to Jesus or Christians who belong to Christ. And that's because suffering is broader than pain. It can be physical but also psychological. It can involve being slandered. It can relate to damaged relationships in marriages, in parenting, in vocation. It can refer to natural disasters like the Philippines. Suffering is broader than just physical pain. And so suffering is when you experience affliction or oppression or pain seems run amok, or pain seems pointless or random. That's the essence of suffering. Maybe I could illustrate it this way. You know, C.S. Lewis states the matter in this way and says, pain is essentially experienced in the body, but suffering is experienced in the soul. Pain is experienced in the body, but suffering is experienced in the soul. The body responds to pain, the soul responds to suffering. You know, if I could explain it this way, you know, I have bad ankles, so if you ever play basketball, which hopefully you will this Thursday, you can put a plug in there for men's ministry, but if you play basketball, I wear 2 ankle braces. I've been spraining my ankle since I was in middle school. I remember sometimes it was pretty bad, just writhing around on the court. But when I was spraining my ankle and holding it and wincing and rolling around the court, never in that moment or even reflecting back, I never thought to myself, my God, why have you forsaken me? I never thought, God, why is this happening? Why are you allowing this to happen to me? Why did you not give me better ankles, God? Why did you let this issue happen in my life, God? Are you wise? You never think that. You're like, well, you sprained your ankle, let me fix it. But suffering is different because it's really pain that's run amok. Suffering is something like losing a loved one to cancer. Suffering is where you don't understand why your marriage doesn't work well. Suffering is where you feel like you loved your child, but your child rebels. Suffering is when natural disasters happen. You don't know why it happens. The experience can be so much harder. And in that moment, when you're suffering, you instantaneously become a philosopher or theologian because you begin to ask the questions of ultimate nature. Why is this happening, God? What's the purpose? How can you let this happen if you're all loving and you're all powerful? Because suffering is a response to the soul. The soul is a response to suffering. And begin to question all you know of God and his wisdom and his love and his truth and sovereignty. That's the difference between suffering and simply pain. That's why it's so difficult. And that's why Jesus comes here and he says, I know you're going to ask the deepest questions of life. You're going to start questioning my character, but Jesus comes in forcefully and he praises them and he praises his church and he says, you are suffering well in light of persecution and oppression. He knows it. He sees it. He commends it. He knows you're suffering as well. He knows all of you that are struggling with depression. He knows all of you that are dealing with difficult marriages. He knows all of you with the anxiety of financial stress. He knows all of you who are dealing with a disease or a potential loss of a loved one. Jesus says, I know your tribulation, and I'm here. I get it. And he's commending you to persevere and to be faithful like he does in the church in Smyrna. Now, before we move on to point number 2, I want to say this. The suffering specifically in Smyrna, which helps to color the church, comes to us in 2 ways. Specifically, it comes by poverty and slander, and they're really related. You know, because back in the city of Smyrna, really the Jewish religion had an umbrella of protection, probably because it was just a long religion. And so in Smyrna, usually what you had to do is participate in some sort of pagan worship, especially just proclaiming Caesar as Lord. But the Jews were to some degree protected for that, probably because of the development of Smyrna and the development of the Jewish religion. But the problem was Christians in that time sort of looked like Jewish people. So Christians experienced a level of protection. But think about it. What would happen between Jews and Christians? Jews would start getting frustrated with Christians. They're distorting our religion. They're talking about a suffering Messiah. They're taking the law and they're distorting this. And they probably also got frustrated because Jewish brethren would get converted to Christianity. So what did the Jewish people do? They tattletaled. They told on the Roman government, say that Christian group, they're not a Jewish group. They're an entirely different religious group. And so then the Roman government comes in and begins to persecute them. And sometimes this happened by way of financial resources. Christians, they were not able to become rich because to become rich in that city of Smyrna, you had to participate in some level of pagan worship. You had to proclaim Caesar as God. The Jews had some protection, Christians no longer. So it's really a question, do I proclaim Caesar as Lord, or am I faithful and proclaim that Jesus is Lord at the sake of becoming rich? That's a persecution. Now, before we move on to the second point, I don't have this in my notes, but I just want to say a quick point. One of the applications of this, especially if you're in sales or in the corporate world, is very difficult, but one of the applications is really this. If you hold on to Jesus and are very faithful, if you ask yourself the question, if I'm really living and applying the application of the gospel in every area of my life, would it make a difference in my promotion? Would it make a difference in how much I make? That's a question you need to struggle with. That's a question you need to think about. Because sometimes the Bible will compel you to say, even if you don't make as much money, or even if you're not as wealthy, or even if you don't move up the corporate world as much because you want to apply Christian biblical practices in your workforce, the gospel may be compelling you to think about that and to apply that. Let's move on to point number 2. Jesus praises the church, but he also gives them a precept, a commandment. And this is what he says. He commands them, and he gives them an exhortation to suffer more. Now, it's funny because you expect Jesus to come here, and he says, you're suffering well, and you expect him to come here and to say, you know what, I'm going to comfort you now. You know, he praises them for their faithfulness, and you expect Jesus to come and say, you know what, you're suffering, don't worry, it's about to be over real quick. Just a little bit longer and it's all over. It'll all be done away with in a few moments. That's what you want Jesus to really say. That's what you expect him to say. But in reality, Jesus comes in. He says, I know your tribulation, but you know what? Things are about to get a lot worse. Things are about to get far worse than you realize. You're being persecuted financially. Guess what? You're about to be persecuted physically, even to the point of death, according to verse 10. So you're suffering now, but you're about to suffer more. And Jesus says, your story's about to get worse. This is what you got to do. He says, don't fear. That's his commandment. That's a precept. Don't worry. Don't be scared of suffering. And also be faithful even if you're about to die. He says suffering is going to get worse, but don't worry. Don't worry about suffering. And be faithful unto death. And you hear this, and your first reaction when you read this is, this has got to be crazy. This is so unreasonable. I've suffered enough, and you're telling me it's going to be worse. This isn't for me. Jesus, aren't you asking too much? And how in the world can he expect this from us? That's probably what your reaction is. That's what I would be thinking if I was in the city of Smyrna. But you know what? These commandments tell us something of the nature of suffering, but more importantly, they tell us something of the nature of Jesus. That's why Jesus can give these commandments. See, Jesus doesn't say, don't worry about suffering. He doesn't say, be faithful to the point of death. Got it? Good, I'm out of here. That's not what he says. He says, be faithful, don't worry, but you know what? I'm going to be there right with you. That's why it's comforting. That's why it's possible. Jesus doesn't tell them to do something without giving them the power in Jesus to do it. Do not fear death because my loving presence is with you. Do not fear death because I'm the giver of life. Don't worry because I'm in control of everything. That's why he could give these commandments. See, every letter in Revelation begins with the introduction of Jesus. And the introduction of Jesus matches the need of the church. So in Ephesus, the problem was they lost their first love. It's matched by the introduction of Jesus, who loves them and dwells among the 7 lampstands. You lost your first love? Don't worry. I'm here and I'm covering you. I'm dwelling with you. The church at Smyrna, the problem or the commandment, don't be afraid of death, be faithful. It's matched by Jesus' description in verse 8. You don't have to fear death because I am the first and the last who died and came to life. I am the giver of life. And that should provide a lot of comfort for us because whatever Jesus tells us is matched by something in him in which he is described in verse 8. You don't have to fear suffering and death because Jesus is the first and last. You have to worry about suffering because Jesus is sovereign over history. That's what Jesus Christ is trying to tell us. He's in control of all things. He's a giver of life. That's why the church doesn't have to fear suffering and can be faithful because Jesus is with you. Now, when you look at these verses, I want to get a couple of points about suffering here. It tells us something about the nature of suffering. And so first, when you look in verse 10, you'll notice this, that verse 10 tells us that even though suffering seems chaotic and out of control, verse 10 is telling us suffering has an order and suffering has a purpose. So you may not know what that is, but that's what verse 10 is telling us. That's why Jesus says, I'm the first and the last. I'm eternal. I am in control of all things. Nothing happens outside of my control. Look at verse 10 with me. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Now, the 10 days is not literal. It's probably symbolic, referencing the book of Daniel. But basically, Jesus said there's a period of suffering. There's a period. But the point is that there's an end to it. That's why Jesus is in control. You think Satan wants to put you in prison for 10 days? No, he wants to put you to prison forever, even to the point of death. But Jesus, every time, will overrule and override the devil's plan. That's why there's a control, there's an order over the suffering. There's an end point. He's sovereign over it. That's why Martin Luther, he had this famous quote. He says, yes, Satan exists, but he's God's Satan, meaning that God has control over Satan. Satan has a plan, but he's always overruled. Jesus always overrides Satan's plans because there's a control to this. And this should provide us a level of comfort because no matter how you're struggling today, Jesus is saying, you may not know exactly why you're suffering, but don't worry. It's all under control. I got it. Everything is under my control. I'm the first and the last. Nothing happens that's not allowed in my sovereign power over history. And so some of you always think, man, life gets all messed up. It's senseless and it's meaningless when I suffer. It's all pointless. But in reality, life isn't messed up. It's just your plans have gotten messed up. It's not that life is meaningless. It's that your life hasn't gone according to your plan. So when your plans get messed up, you think life is meaningless. But in reality, there is a plan behind this life because Jesus is in control of all things. Now, Halloween came quickly this year, and I don't know how many parents went trick-or-treating, but you may have seen this on Facebook or on YouTube, but there's a really funny video clip by Jimmy Kimmel, and what he actually does, he says to all the parents, on the next day after Halloween or trick-or-treating, I want you to video record your child and tell your child that you ate all the Halloween candy. You ate all Halloween candy and just see their reaction. So all these parents just flood YouTube, and then Jimmy Kimmel will take a couple. And it's interesting to see how these children respond. It's almost as if it's a life and death situation. Child comes up, mom and dad says, sorry, honey, we ate all the Halloween candy. And all the tears start coming down. One child was like, I walked around 2 hours in the neighborhood for this candy. And you ate it all? Another kid he starts spitting at his parents. I hate you, I hate you. That's not very kind. Says all kinds of things. See, sometimes in life, we're like that child, and we spit at God. We think God took away our candy. We spit at him. That's not very kind. I worked so hard, God. Why'd you take this away from me? I'm trying so hard. Why are you doing this to me? And the reality behind this is really because Jesus has an order and plan to your suffering. John Newton has a great quote about this. He essentially says this: everything is necessary that God sends, but nothing is necessary that he withholds. Until you can embrace that, you'll never get a grip on the Christian life and suffering. Do you see what he's saying, how profound that is? Everything is necessary that he sends into your life. Nothing is necessary that he withholds. Because Jesus is the first and the last, and he has a purpose behind this. And so there's a control to suffering, but we also see that there's a purpose to suffering. We see this in verse 10 again. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested. J.I. Packer said spiritual growth can't be measured, but only tested. I like to nuance that a little bit, but I get his point. Spiritual growth can't be measured, but only tested. It's not like I could go to people and say, you're mature on a scale of 1 to 10, you're a 7. A lot of times, spiritual maturity and growth can only be tested. One of the reasons why suffering happens, not only because God is in control of it, but he does it to test you. He wants to show you what you're really made of. That's what he's saying. So no, you have a house that's built on a foundation. If it's a weak foundation, the wind will blow it over. Something like that fairy tale or that children's story, the three little pigs. Whatever your house crumbles on shows you the foundation of it. But if it's the one house that won't be blown down and the waves can crash upon this house but stands firm, it has a firm foundation. The Christian life is the same way. Jesus wants to make sure who really is standing on his authority. Jesus wants to make sure what you're really made of. Some of you will be that house that blows over at the slightest wind. And it shows you what your life is made of. You're being tested. And it shows what your heart is really holding on to. But others of you, through the most difficult times of your suffering, will persevere and will be faithful. Because then it shows that the foundation of your life is nothing less than Jesus Christ himself, who is in control of all suffering and has a loving purpose for it, to make you more like him and to prove that you really belong to Jesus Christ. So Jesus gives them a praise. He gives them a precept. And our last and quickest point before we close is that he gives them a promise. As a child, I loved to go to Burger King, and they used to have those crowns. I don't know if they do that. Put a crown on, the paper crown. Now, everyone loves to do this. Children, little girls love to put on tiaras. Boys will put on crown. I'm the king of the world. We love to do this. And what's so beautiful about the promise is that Jesus is telling us exactly that. He says in verses 10 to 11, "Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second life, the second death." The promise here is to the one who is faithful till the end, to the one who perseveres. He says, if you conquer, I'm going to give you a crown of life. Crown is a symbol of victory. The crown here means that you're participating in the victorious rule of Jesus. That's why it's given to the one who perseveres in life and conquers. The one who's faithful even to death is ironically the one who receives this crown. And it's not a crown of gold. It's not a crown of jewels. It's not a crown of paper. It's a crown of life. Another way to say this, if I could be as bold, is to say it's a life crown. It's an eternal life crown. If you're faithful in your destiny, your promise, if you're faithful in life, is that you're going to have this eternal life crown that is anointed upon your head for overcoming suffering and persecution in the world. And Jesus promised this one to the one who perseveres. And the real reason that you're able to persevere in what Jesus is saying is because in Jesus Christ, Christ who bore the crown of thorns is the one in whom you now participate and wear the crown of life. The only reason you can suffer well is because Jesus has already went down that path before you. The only reason that you can not fear what may happen is because Jesus, who was actually scared in the Garden of Gethsemane, said, my God, take this away from me. He went down and experienced more fear than you did. And when he suffered and took on the crown of thorns that represented the punishment and the ridicule and the shame, he did all this so that we can persevere and receive the crown of life. And if I could sum up the entire message in this way, this is essentially what Jesus is saying. He's saying, for those of us who will suffer, in the end, you will win. They will lose. Hang in there. Some of you may not feel like you're on your last thread, but Jesus is saying, I know your tribulation. In the end, you will win. They will lose. Hang in there. Because I'm the first and the last, and I've died, and I came to life. I've taken on the crown of thorns so that you can have a crown of life. Let me close with this. I got this from a book by Melvin Tinker. I think it was something, Providence of God in Suffering. He shares a testimony about a Christian missionary couple by the name of John and Betty Stam. Back in December 6, 1934, they were missionaries, I believe, in China. And as they were bathing their brand new newborn baby, the Red Army of China came in, took them across, put them through shame, marched them through the town in their underwear, and eventually they were martyred for their faith. The parents obviously were distraught. Betty, who was martyred, had a sister. Her name was Helen, and this is what she writes to her parents, and we'll close with this. She says, "Dearest Daddy and Mommy, You don't need to hear me say how much we love you and are thinking of you and praying for you in these last days. I have such radiant pictures of Betty and John standing with their palms of victory before the throne, singing a song of pure joy because they had given everything they had to their master. And that I cannot break loose and cry about it as people expect. Crying seems too petty for such a thing that was so manifestly in God's hands alone. But my heart is very, very sore for you. Or perhaps in the words of Job, what she is saying is that I know my Redeemer lives. Let us pray. Father, I thank you so much that, Lord, although we don't know everything that happens in life, we could feel comfort and a calm and assurance because you are the one in control. We thank you, Lord, so much, oh Father, because you have a purpose and that you are the giver of life. So, Lord, I ask for each and every one of us, for all the suffering, for all the trials, for all the struggles that we're facing in this world, would you, Lord, make yourself preeminent and glorious. Help us to see the victorious Christ who is sovereign over history so that we may have comfort and fear not what may come and be faithful even to the point of death. So, Lord, we thank you and we pray all these things in Jesus Christ.